Welcome to Engage ICT. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. When someone is prosecuted for committing a crime, a very long line of dominoes is struck. But how orderly is law and order in Kansas? We're going to talk about the state of incarceration tonight on Engage ICT with an excellent panel. Kylie Cameron is a news reporter at KMUW. Monique Centeno is an attorney as well as a part-time judge for Sedgwick County District Court. Jim Echols is the executive director of Reaching Out from Within, and Stephen Stonehouse is the director of Sedgwick County Department of Corrections. Thank you all for joining us. Stephen, you were in the corrections field for a long time before moving into the director position. Will you help frame our situation today? How would you describe the current state of our criminal justice system in Kansas?
So the Sedgwick County Department of Corrections provides juvenile and adult services for folks involved in the criminal justice field, starting at the age of 10 to throughout their adult relationship with us. So we work with people in the community, people in the juvenile detention facility, pre-arrest, and also supervising folks in an adult residential program. So we have a wide variety of community-based programs. I would say that the state of the juvenile justice system is one of flux a bit because we are coming off pretty significant juvenile justice reform in Senate Bill 367. So we are still finding our footing a bit with that. Our numbers have really decreased, and that's what the bill was supposed to do. So, and that has occurred, but also ramping up community-based services to meet the needs of the kids who are now placed in the community and not sent off to placement has been a challenge for providers and for us as the Department of Corrections. In the adult services, we're really coming off of everybody. We're all coming off of what COVID has done to the criminal justice system. It's backed up the court system, and it's really affected also our ability to staff our programs. The Department of Corrections in Sedgwick County really exists to serve as an alternative in the adult corrections world. We operate a pretrial program which serves to offer a release option for folks who can't make bail otherwise, so they can be released under our supervision. And with the courts being backed up, that's really lengthened the time that folks are on that. So it puts pressure on the staff that we do have to have larger and larger caseloads to try to manage that. And then also in the adult world, we have had to close down our juvenile residential program, which is an alternative to secure detention, because we simply can't safely staff it. We don't have enough staff. So we have options, but being able to operate them right now is a challenge. And that's how I would describe what we're looking at right now in Sedgwick County with the Department of Corrections.
And we'll hear more from Monique in a moment about working as a judge because of this backlog. But did this issue with staffing primarily come out of the issue with COVID?
Yes,
or was this...
that's when it was really exacerbated. We do have some ARPA funds for an intake officer to deal with folks as they're getting put on to probation, try to help with that backlog. We're able to expand our adult residential program to accept more women into our program. So we're trying to set the footing to be able to serve folks once we are able to hire enough staff to do that. The Sedgwick County did raise the wages for all of our staff, and the Kansas Department of Corrections helped with that. So we are seeing an increase in applicants and in new staff, but it's just slow. It's very slow. And I know our judges in juvenile court definitely like to have alternative options other than having kids sitting in juvenile detention. They like a residential facility. They like home-based monitoring. They like different options, and we really want to be able to offer those.
Let's come to you, Monique, and we'll return to several of those topics here as the hour goes on. But Monique, you have some 10 years or so experience in public defense and have kind of worked in a variety of functions in law. Let's talk about what happens as far as your vantage point, what you have seen in the pre-incarceration period, or at least pre-sentencing, everything, from that first visit or that first brush with law enforcement into the time of sentencing. Can you describe kind of the path that takes for individuals and just your observations of the system?
Right. So typically, when I was a public defender, I would see, you're seeing people at the worst points of their life. They've been charged with a felony, and oh my gosh, right? So typically someone is arrested, and then a judge issues a bond amount, usually based upon the charge, and the judge will know a little bit about the facts surrounding it, but not necessarily everything. And then a public defender will be appointed if one is required. And then I would see people, as a defendant, you want to get out of custody, which means that you want a motion to reduce your bond to be filed immediately. You want to get a hearing immediately. And so I think since COVID has happened, I know for a fact that the court system has slowed dramatically. We have to keep in mind that Sedgwick County is the largest county in Kansas. And the judges here have tremendous caseloads. But the judges are dealing with their own health, their own families, and their own initial concerns about catching COVID. We all were thrown into this COVID situation haphazardly, so we all were just kind of doing the best we could, which put things behind dramatically. So that went on for about 2 years. I know that the criminal justice system here in Sedgwick County is still trying to carve its way out of the hole. I don't have much experience with juveniles in this arena, but I did have a lot with adults. And so we here in Sedgwick County, we're years behind. But the question was really, what can a person expect? They can expect a bond hearing. They will be present typically, but now I think that has changed since COVID. So usually it's just the lawyers and the defendant is seen on video. Arguments are made, a judge will make a decision. And, if everything works out, that person may be given an OR bond, released on his own recognizance. Typically here, they're also placed on pretrial services. So they have conditions and they have to go meet a corrections officer that probably works for Stephen and go through that process. It's kind of like mini probation. You're being supervised while your case is being litigated, and you can expect to be supervised that entire time until the case goes to trial and a verdict is rendered, or until a plea agreement is made, or, unless a case is thrown out by the prosecutor's office or dismissed by a judge at some point.
And
but that's what you can expect.
And that is if you are released on bond, on bail.
Or if you're released on an OR bond, or if you can pay for the bond amount once it's reduced by a judge, if a judge believes that it's appropriate to reduce. So, I think, so the bond amount is really the real problem here for people who are in custody, right? Not everybody's going to be eligible for it to be out on an OR bond, out on their own recognizance. Some people are going to be given a reduction in their bond from where it was initially, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get out quickly,
And that's if you can afford to put up the money for the bail.
That's correct.
Yeah, and if you can't, then you are
right. Mm-hmm. As a public defender, I would see families come together, families and friends come together to help get someone out of custody.
Mm-hmm. Because otherwise that individual will remain in the Sedgwick County Jail until they're trial.
That's right.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about sentencing guidelines. And I think this is, something, maybe Monique, if you want to start off on this as well, and then Stephen, if you have something to add too. I know that that's something that has changed over the years. How have you kind of observed that evolution, Monique?
So there was a time, this is many, many years ago, there was a time where we didn't have guidelines. So a judge was left to decide things with his own discretion. Usually it was a he. We didn't have many women judges at that time. But there was a tremendous fluctuation of the punishments that people were given, be it discrimination because of race or nationality. It could be a multitude of things. And so the system decided, hey, we're going to come together and provide a sentencing guideline grid and a sentencing guideline handbook that all the judges are going to use. And you can see, based upon the level of your offense and your past criminal history, you can use that to determine how much time that whether you are looking at presumptive probation, meaning you are going to get probation, or whether you're going to get your presumptive prison, you're going to go to prison, or do you fall in the border box? It could be probation, it could be prison. And so it narrows down the abilities that a judge has, right? And so everyone uses it. Everyone, meaning defense attorneys and prosecutors, use it when charging, when deciding what a plea agreement will be. And it's certainly used at sentencing when a person is sentenced. So I think, people gripe about the sentencing guidelines in the handbook, and they've been griping about it for years. But I think prior to that, we were in a Wild West situation. You never knew what a judge was going to do. And what the guidelines gives you is a framework.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you see this as having been a positive thing overall, that now, a judge couldn't just decide, well, because I like your face, I'm going to, give you a lighter sentence, or the opposite. It seemed to be an overall positive thing from your vantage point?
There are exceptions that the handbook has and that the guideline gives. I wasn't necessarily happy about how narrow those exceptions would be when I was a practicing defense attorney. But I see in a judge seat, I see the utility of it, right? If we're all coming from this baseline and I can only work within this particular box of punishments, and I know that that all the other judges are expected to use this same box, well, it will regulate the disparities, or it attempts to regulate the disparities that defendants receive when they're sentenced. So in my opinion, it's a good thing. It's like everything can be manipulated. However, I do think that it was a good move, definitely.
So then a lot of the situation that we have in our criminal justice system overall comes down to the laws and rules that our elected officials institute over different elements. And Kylie, you just this morning were watching a meeting with City Council, and I think you have some audio that you can share. Will you talk about kind of what led up to this and give us some context before you play the audio clips?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this morning the Wichita City Council essentially decriminalized the possession of fentanyl test strips. Basically these strips that you can use to test whatever substance for any traces of fentanyl. And, obviously that came about because we're in a crisis right now. Sedgwick County and the rest of America is in a crisis when it comes to fentanyl, when it comes to opioid addiction. And so they saw this as an essential tool to help people going through this, to make sure that people aren't dying and they know what they're taking before they take it. Technically, fentanyl test strips are still illegal under Kansas statute. That was not changed this past legislative session. Certain lawmakers believe that it enables drug use. But then again, you still have people who believe that, it doesn't matter whether it enables drug use, it's saving people's lives regardless. But then you also had the Wichita City Council also essentially decriminalized possession of marijuana through their municipal courts. And so now what will happen is, instead of, the city's court system charging people for marijuana possession, say you get pulled over, you have marijuana on you, instead of going through the city court, you now be going through the county DA's office. And the city sees, about more than 750 of those cases a year with just marijuana possession. However, the district attorney, Mark Bennett, and I'll play you this clip, said that may not have an impact on incarceration. Let me have him explain it.
These notions that somehow it's simply a benign thing and we're just trying to lock people up. We don't lock people up. Our jails and prisons in Kansas are not full, and anyone who tells you otherwise are not full of marijuana possessors. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying to you or they haven't done the research.
So basically there he's just explaining that, people are not sitting in jail just because they have marijuana possession charges. And that may be true. But there's also a good chunk of people who are sitting in our jails right now who do have marijuana possession charges, but they have other charges to go along with it that are a bit more serious. Regardless, though, you still also have, it's a cycle. Everything's connected together. And so, even if you don't sit in jail, this could still play into some sort of cycle when it comes to, if you have a drug conviction on your record, a lot of places won't employ you. Your top employers here in the city of Wichita, Textron, Spirit, even the city itself, don't employ people who have drug convictions. And so then it can make it difficult for them to receive employment and put them in pretty hard spots. And I'll play this clip that kind of also explains that. This is from SEIU President Esau Freeman at today's city council meeting.
Anecdotally, I've seen too many friends who have found themselves in those positions of homelessness and in those positions of additional substance abuse, because the real gateway isn't the substance itself, it's the overreach of government in their own lives.
Really, that kind of fully encompasses kind of what happened at today's city council meeting.
Very interesting. So some changes there. I'm curious, I want to come to you, Jim, and talk about when individuals are incarcerated, just kind of an idea of what programs and options exist for them right now. Can you share a little bit about reaching out from within?
Sure will, and be happy to. And that is our program, basically, as far as the pre-release status of returning citizens, we work with them and we form a group committee comprised of pre-release returning citizens, and we form a committee that's actually chaired by someone who is in pre-release status. We have staff and volunteers from reaching out from within to go in, and we get our security badges and so on, and approved by the corrections headquarters to have badges, and we can enter during those times that are set for us to join the returning citizens in their weekly meetings. The meetings are usually weekly. They usually have a format, again, led by returning citizen who actually chairs that meeting. Even our staff and volunteers are strictly passive attendees, and passive participants. The leadership and all of the drive, the topic for the evening, so on, is always determined and shared by the returning citizen group. We are basically working with them to kind of structure and share ideas regarding issues that led to criminal conviction, subsequent incarceration, and just open discussions. And those discussions are to be held behind the walls there, and those discussions will remain. The content behind the walls among the participants there, and we don't discuss individual conversations and personalities at all once we depart the facilities. We are basically talking about things that led up to the incarcerations, I said, and what we can do to try and create an attitude among the individuals and participants that when they're released, that they will be more focused as far as self-discipline, as far as temperament, and as far as issues that can be related to problem-solving issues that might arise that could lead to further conflict and possibly abuse or even violence that might lead to a return to incarceration. And so we're trying to basically deal with some of the mental and say psychosocial or psychological aspects of preparation before they depart, so that their frame of mind hopefully has been enhanced in a positive manner, so that their release, there's a greater chance for success. We spend a lot more time, of course, once they're have actually departed incarceration and they're back out in society. There are so many moving parts there, and I'll hold that for a subsequent or later question here. But that's kind of how we deal with the initial inception of incarceration and the period there as it leads up to pre-release.
And so this this sort of rehabilitative work is in essence driven by those individuals who are incarcerated or who once were. What do you think? How does the sort of evolution of legislation, how does that hit you when you think about those shifts in just the rules that exist, from sentencing guidelines to, you know, now this shift today in fentanyl test strips no longer being criminalized here in Wichita? How much does that interplay with the experience that individuals have when they're incarcerated and their ability to kind of rehabilitate?
Yeah, I think it has quite a bit. And I know Stephen can appreciate, because much of the problems and conflict has been issues of overcrowding within the facilities. The populations have been at times astronomical, far exceeding what was expected to be the capacity of facilities. And so obviously if certain things are decriminalized or lesser serious as far as the convictions, there might be situations where it will be an immediate reduction in the number who are actually incarcerated, particularly in a regular prison facility versus a community correctional facility. And so I think the populations will shift tremendously. I'm not sure what the results might be as far as, will there be adequate deterrence from individuals as far as some of those things that might be involved in current levels of conviction versus the change or not to be seen. But I think the most immediate would be populations. And again, I'd like to hear when the question comes from you, Sarah, what Steve might think about that.
Absolutely. It really opens up questions of, you know, preventative legislation, if this legislation actually deters crime or not, and how to in the end, have a society that experiences the least amount of criminal behavior. And I want to go into this sort of overpopulation idea. I have a clip that I would like to play for you all from last week's Engage ICT mini interview with Wichita State's Michael Berzer about more or less the history of incarceration. And I'll ask you, Stephen, to respond to this after we hear it. Let's take a listen.
This has been coming on, if you look historically across the country since the 1960s, we've tripled and fourfold our prison populations over time. There's a lot of reasons for that. A big one is just crime policy over the years has changed. And as crime increases, typically crime policy gets tougher. And we went, for example, in Kansas back in the early 90s, we went to what's called sentencing guidelines. Before that, we were using what was called indeterminate sentences. So for example, under the indeterminate model, a judge could sentence someone to 5 years to 10 years in the state prison. Then it becomes up to the inmate to really kind of prove themselves while they're in prison. If they abide by the rules and have good conduct, they could be out fairly quickly. But now we have minimum mandatories on the sentencing guidelines, which basically there's not a lot of room for departure unless there's some mitigating circumstances.
Stephen, what are your thoughts on that clip, and what do you think is kind of the biggest factor in overpopulation as an issue?
Well, obviously, Dr. Berzer has it right on that indeterminate sentences were part of the juvenile justice system until just a few years ago. So that's just been a recent change, and we have seen our numbers fall. But I think when he talks about policy driving the population, that speaks to substance abuse, addiction, mental health treatment, and homelessness, all are factors. And we live in an urban center in Kansas, so those are things that are driving folks into the system where we live. So policy has changed in that we have specialized Senate Bill 123, which is a specialized drug caseload, which gives money for treatment for folks on probation instead of sending them to prison. We have drug court operated by the Sedgwick County Department of Corrections. So instead of sending those folks to prison, they have intensive treatment and a weekly meeting with the judge, a prosecutor, defense attorney, and their ISO to try to keep them in the community. We're also going to be standing up Veterans Treatment Court as well to identify those folks on community corrections who are also veterans. We're going to partner with the district court and with the VA to try to get those folks treatment instead of sending them to prison. But of course, this all is dependent upon having the treatment facilities and the staff to make those programs run. But I think there's definitely the will of the legislature to serve these folks, and also the county commission to serve these folks in the community. There's a realization that we need these specialty courts. We need treatment for them, and for the most part, they have been provided. But I will say, Kylie talked earlier about crisis of fentanyl. We know there's a crisis of fentanyl with our adult population, but there is also a crisis of fentanyl in our juvenile populations. I've been working in juvenile corrections for 25 years, and this is the first year where we've had kids overdose. And I said kids, more than one, die while on supervision because of fentanyl. There is no inpatient drug treatment for juveniles in Sedgwick County. There's one in the state of Kansas, that's in Johnson County. Thank God we have it, but we compete with 104 counties for those beds. We're the largest urban population in Kansas, and we have no inpatient treatment for our juveniles. So we have to stand in line and wait for them to go to Johnson County. So while the state and the county have stepped up and do recognize what we need for adult population, we're still behind in the juvenile population. I heard from the chief probation officer just last week that somebody was assessed last week and he could not get into inpatient treatment, a juvenile, until November. So he's sitting here in the juvenile detention facility. That obviously is not the point. that we still have a ways to go with that system, because simply keeping somebody in here in the juvenile detention facility does not help him deal with his issues. And these are fentanyl issues, kids using fentanyl. And Kylie talked about the test strips, is because lots of times the kids that we have seen who have overdosed and died did not think they were taking fentanyl. They thought they were taking something else. So we can be righteous and say they shouldn't use it, but they don't think they are. So I think that's a reality that we have to consider.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. And the opioid crisis and now fentanyl has been kind of a growing crisis. But how, I mean, are we responding to it at any speed at all? Or is it new enough that we just really haven't been able to get our legs under us to respond to this? Or would you say that Sedgwick County, Kansas are sort of lagging in responding compared nationally?
I can't really say compared nationally. I just know that with adult services, that the resources are definitely in place for folks, more so than with the juvenile population. That is definitely something we're lagging in, because we do have a drug court. The city of Wichita also has a drug court, and we do have inpatient definitely in the city and in the metro area. So I think there is continued need to understand how to use services for families when they're in the middle of a crisis, and helping them to stop it from getting to the place of an overdose or something where we just can't come back from.
I'll chime in real quick, sorry. I think part of the issue too is the patchwork of laws that we have when it comes to, just fentanyl test strips, right? Or, how we're going to, is possessing those illegal. And so, in the state legislature this year, that legislation that would have decriminalized fentanyl test strips and not make them drug paraphernalia did not pass, and it didn't get out of committee. But cities and other law enforcement agencies took it upon themselves to decide whether or not they wanted to treat that as drug paraphernalia. So obviously today you saw the city of Wichita do that. I believe Hutchinson, I think Reno County doesn't do that because their fentanyl crisis is just as bad as Sedgwick County, maybe even worse. And it's worse because they're in a rural area. They don't have as many resources as we would here in an urban court, like Stephen said.
If I could chime in too, I think, when we're talking about overpopulations of correctional facilities or jails, we can't forget about the mental health aspect. In the city of Wichita, we do have a mental health court, and we've had it for some time. We don't have such a court in district court. And we have a dramatic amount of criminals, who are called criminals, I'll say people who have been charged with crimes in jail that have tremendous mental health problems and are usually there because their mental health problem is not regulated or they went undiagnosed. There's nowhere for them to go in the state of Kansas. There really isn't. So, I think a lot of there's not much that can be done in way of services when they're in the jail system, in the Sedgwick County jail. A lot of times they're just isolated in different areas, so they won't become victims or victimize others. But the jail is not designed to address the severe mental health crises that we have unaddressed in the state of Kansas, let alone in Sedgwick County.
For those just joining us, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, and this is Engage ICT. We're talking about the state of incarceration in Kansas with KMUW reporter Kylie Cameron, attorney and Judge Monique Centeno, executive director of Reaching Out from Within, Jim Echols, and director of Sedgwick County Department of Corrections, Stephen Stonehouse. I do want to come back to this Veterans Court and Drug Court and those relatively new opportunity or different ways to kind of process individuals who are caught with drugs and whatnot, that those exist within or for the city rather than for the county. Can you explain to me where those exist and where they do not?
So the city has drug court, but we operate a drug court with Sedgwick County. So community corrections folks who have a substance abuse history, typically opioids, fentanyl, heroin, that type of thing, in lieu of a prison sentence, they can be assigned to drug court. So that's operated for those folks. And then Veterans Court is something that was just awarded to the district court. We'll be operating it in the community corrections in partnership with the VA. So that's a realization that our veterans have substance abuse issues oftentimes and mental health issues that need to be dealt with differently than incarceration. So we're going to be standing that program up. And there is a hope that we will have a specialty court, mental health court. I mean, Monique talked about that Sedgwick County does not have a mental health court right now. So we are forced to work with those folks with specialized caseloads. Maybe somebody takes an interest in it, but there's not a specialized system to deal with people with severe and persistent mental illness like we do with drug treatment. We have to find workarounds, partner with ComCare, things like that. So there is not a specialty court in district court for folks with mental health treatment issues.
And if I could just say this too, I think, because this is a conversation for the public to know about also, is that just as Stephen was just saying, if a defendant happens to have a drug problem and also has a mental health problem that's persistent and severe, what is that? That's determined by someone else. They are not eligible to be accepted or participate in the drug court program. So, there's all these little things, which is why it's so important that we advocate for specialty courts, right? We see this in other states. I want to say in New Hampshire is one big one, and also Pennsylvania has several different specialty courts. Why is Kansas so behind on this? Probably because of funding. It usually always comes down to funding. Any alternative to sticking someone in a cell for years and years and years. These are things that we should be seeking out as a community, instead of just closing our blinds and pretending it doesn't exist. So.
Kylie, I want to come back to you and talk about what legislation might be discussed or in the works, whether in Wichita or Sedgwick County. I know you might have a read a little bit on statewide legislation as well. Just what you see kind of coming down the pike that might affect the system. What are the kind of the big ones that you're watching?
I mean, statewide right now, the legislature isn't in session and they won't be back in session until January. Even possibly with a new governor, depending on how the governor's race goes this year. That could also really have a huge impact on where the legislature goes when it comes to reforming the criminal justice system. Here in Sedgwick County and the city of Wichita, we've kind of had this almost upheaval a bit of, really taking a step back and looking at our criminal justice system and thinking of it in more of a restorative justice way, and how we can you know, especially when it comes to the youth, when it comes to juveniles, you know, how they can be better served so that they don't re-enter the criminal justice system. And that came about because of the death of Cedric Lofton in the juvenile intake facility here in Sedgwick County, and through the community task force. And so that task force made loads of recommendations, not only for the jails, but for Wichita Police, for 911, a lot of CommCare, mental health aspect. And, you know, through those recommendations, I mean, the juvenile facility made a ton of changes. They have a calming room in there now to try to de-escalate situations. You know, when a juvenile comes in and, you know, they're obviously angry and then pretty combative. And so you have all those things going on, but, you know, along with that, the Sedgwick County is dealing with severe staffing issues. So it's hard to keep up these positive changes that, you know, we've had with Senate Bill 367 when it comes to juvenile justice, because of the lack of staffing in the juvenile system, the residential facility had to close. And so now those juveniles who were in the residential facility are now in confinement, and they're now in the detention. So you really can't address a lot of issues that we're having locally with the criminal justice system unless we can deal with staffing and get well-trained people in there.
This makes me want to kind of go philosophical a little bit here. And I want to come to you, Jim, on this and just to ask you where you think society ought to come down on this sort of spectrum between punitive justice or restorative justice or rehabilitation. What do you think would be a system that would benefit society the most?
Hey, I've had numerous conversations with individuals regarding the things you mentioned here, as far as rehabilitation, as far as restorative justice, and the other. And I think it's important to think about the restorative aspect of justice from the standpoint of restorative, looking at the victims of certain crimes or certain things that might happen, as well as the predator or whatever you want to call the individual who perpetuated the crime. I think both of those are important. I think, again, and Monique mentioned funding and revenue to do certain things. It's important that if correctional facilities are going to be the main spur for rehabilitation, then it's going to cost time, personnel, money, material resources, and so on in order to make that happen. Because in many cases, some facilities themselves can do more to be a breeding ground for new and more serious criminals and crimes in the future than they were before they even were incarcerated. And so it's going to have to be something where we look at what will provide the best opportunity for individuals to be returned to society in a more productive mode, in a mode where they do not go back to prison because the costs are astronomical as far as having someone in prison. And at the same time, we have to look out for the welfare of the general public as far as public safety. Is it safe for individuals to return, or more individuals to return, or to have less incarceration? We have to weigh all of those out, and it gets pretty complicated. It's really overwhelming. But the idea is, when you look at an individual's incarcerated, it's going to impact if the individual has offspring, children who are in school, families who are without enough financial support to pay the rent, buy groceries and so on. It affects our Department of Human Services, our public school districts, along with corrections. And so it's kind of a triad of effects that are taking place, and they all need money and revenue in order to sustain them and make them more adequate. But philosophically, I'm a strong advocate of restorative justice. I think it will go a long way in concert with others as well. I think it'll go a long way to create a more stable environment, a more productive return of citizens back to society, and at the same time, look at what's important as far as the general welfare of the general public and public safety.
Stephen, I'd like to ask you what you feel are the most significant challenges that inmates encounter while they are incarcerated. What are individuals really going through while they're incarcerated?
Well, the opportunity to work. So what Jim was talking about, if somebody's in prison, we're paying for them. They're not working, they're not paying their own way, they're not paying taxes. There's substance abuse. I think if folks can get treatment while they're in an institution, that's great, but oftentimes there's waiting lists. So they might be in prison because or with a substance abuse problem, but they might not get the treatment that the general public or even you and I would think they would get. So, and also mental health treatment. So we might think, well, they're in prison, so they're going to be getting counseling, medication, and that just isn't true. That might not happen. So programs like our adult residential facility, where people are employed, they are paying taxes, they're paying their child support, they pay rent to us, they pay us rent for living there. That's a much better system to rehabilitate somebody in their community. There are residents, there are citizens, there are neighbors. So if we only have 50 people in there right now because of our staffing situation. That means the other 100 plus are either in prison or in the county jail waiting to come. That means those folks, we're paying for them. They're not contributing to society at all. So I think the more that we can do to prepare people, because what Jim was talking about, all these folks are our neighbors and are coming home, quite frankly. The majority of people are not going to spend the rest of their life in prison. So if we can avoid sending them in the first place, and we can provide them with programming that will help them rehabilitate and not reoffend, the cost is huge to put somebody in prison, or even just to have them in the jail or in the juvenile detention facility or the juvenile correctional facility. Any institution costs 3, 4, 5 times as much as a community-based program does. So if we're able to offer that, I think nobody is worse off if we can do that successfully.
Is there any kind of a format or a path that a city or a county could follow to, instead of funneling all of this funding into the jail or the prison, to divert it to programs that are essentially preventative of either initial incarceration or reincarceration after release?
I think it starts in primary prevention for juveniles, for kids, for youth. It's after school programs, it's substance abuse awareness, it's daycare. I've heard that the best crime prevention program is a good preschool. So those are all, but those are not dealing with the problem. So it's yes, and we have to have all those early things, and we also still have to fund prisons because it's not going to take. But
it'll take a generation.
It'll take a generation to fix it, but we have to decide as a population, what do we want to be funding? Do we want to fund prisons? Because I believe there are some folks that need to be there. But then we have an obligation to treat them while they're there and not
Mm.
just to warehouse them, because they will be coming home, and I don't want them to be my neighbor if they haven't had any treatment.
I wanted to come back to the work release programs that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Is it correct? There are two different kinds of work release programs in Wichita. Can you describe those for us?
There are the Kansas Department of Corrections offers a work release program. It's operated like one of their institutions. So they can move inmates in and out of there depending on how they're doing in their sentence, and then also to prepare them to release. So that's run by the Kansas Department of Corrections. And we operate a work release in adult residential center. The work release folks are sentenced by the court for lower level misdemeanor, sometimes child support, different things like that. So instead of sitting in the county jail, they're sentenced to work release, and then they have to work and serve their time there. And also we have an adult residential program. Instead of, oftentimes if somebody has a violation of their probation, instead of sending them to prison, the court will allow them to go to the adult residential center. And that's operated by us, where they're able to work and have treatment and participate in community activities instead of going to prison. That's often their last step before they go.
So we are getting short on time here. I want to ask one more question. Well, I'll be tricky and ask two questions. It's a question option situation. And I'd like for each of you to answer this. Either how can people help with this issue, which is so complicated and broad, or what is it that people you think don't understand or need to know about this topic? And Monique, will you go first?
Yes, I think the biggest thing that people need to know is that the legislature runs everything, right? The laws are made by the legislature, they're passed by the legislature, and then everyone has to enforce those laws. So if you care about this topic, you got to go talk to your legislator. You got to let your voice be heard by your legislator. And I think that legislatures are doing the best that they can, but oftentimes, a lot of times, they will pass a law, but they don't really think about or know how it impacts the larger population of whatever law that they're trying to change, right? I'd love to see the legislature speak to not just concerned citizens about overpopulation, but also speak to folks who practice in this area to see if this law will have a domino effect and affect other things. We saw that a lot with the driver's license restrictions, driving while suspended, and so on. But everything starts with the legislature. So if you care about this, make your voice heard.
Thank you. Kylie, what do you think?
I think part of what people should understand is, it's easy for the legislature for them to kind of maintain the status quo. And so like Monique said, it's really reaching out to them and, making your voice heard. I mean, we had this task force here in Sedgwick County that did make their voice heard, and we got some changes here. But it's easy to maintain the status quo. We can say, we want more restorative justice models. But, you get legislators who come in and don't understand how it impacts the citizens here in Kansas. They don't have the lived experiences. They don't know people who have gone through these things, or just haven't talked to people who have gone through the criminal justice system. So it's easy to maintain the status quo, but like Monique said, it's really reaching out and showing we want this done, or something to prevent it. Like Stephen was saying earlier, to prevent, an increase in crime or overcrowding in our jails. It's facing those issues early on, but you also have to face them while they're happening.
Stephen, what would you say?
I would say if folks are interested in this topic, that because I'm a community corrections guy, when we have volunteers in all of our programs, and we also have 2 advisory boards who, so what Monique talked about with who make recommendations to the legislature, make recommendations to the county commissioners. So they're made up by volunteers. So if you want your voice heard on this topic, and unfortunately in our adult advisory board, we don't have a lot of applicants. Fortunately, we do for juveniles, but we don't have a lot of applicants for our adult advisory board. But if people are interested in seeing changes in the adult system, the advisory board is 11 or 12 people. That's a pretty loud voice to prove what happens with the criminal justice system in Sedgwick County. So I always push for our volunteer programs that we have in all of our facilities and our advisory boards.
Thank you. And Jim, you have the last word. How can people help, or what do people need to understand more of?
And let me just kind of focus, if I can, on the re-entry portion of post-release. And of course, in most cases, there's a supervised probationary period of time that they're under supervision of probation, parole officers, and so on. But during this time, there are some things that have occurred. For example, the COVID we experienced going back during the past couple of years reduced, obviously, the number of people who were in the workforce. And so we had to kind of restart getting people back to work after things began to calm down. Meanwhile, many businesses, and particularly service industries, were suffering severe shortages of staffing, personnel, employees. This was a time that our organization, working with local employers, both private sector, government, nonprofit, faith-based as well, took an extra step and became much more intense in our efforts on behalf of sponsoring individuals who are returning citizens for employment. Right now, society, as far as workforce, we need about, in a couple, or as far as births, we need about 2.2 per family to replace deaths that are taking place in society. And right now, we are actually have a replacement figure of about 1.8. And so we're falling very short of even replacing those who are deceasing or passing on. We did find that employers became a lot more receptive to hiring individuals who might have had a criminal record, again, depending on what the actual convictions were, the levels they were, and the types of crimes. But we did find an immediate response that was positive, particularly in the private sector, for an opportunity for entry-level employment, training, and opportunities for upward mobility. That was a good thing. We have everyone that we work with, where we start with pre-release and then spent time post-release with individuals for successful reentry. We encourage those individuals immediately to volunteer at their church or at a food pantry or some place where they can volunteer, even if it's just a couple of hours a week. Volunteer with the actual idea being it's an opportunity to establish a positive reference for your dependability, your accountability, and assumption being the bottom line, if an individual will volunteer in a food pantry or in some other organization that will be helpful to society, then surely that same individual will be even more dependable if they're being paid. for the time that they spend. And so we worked that and we found great things happen. Obviously, we were not pleased with the COVID coming, but we did find that for our particular demographic and the clientele we serve, it was a real boon as far as new employment opportunities, and we still take advantage of it.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you all for this, joining with this Engage ICT conversation. It was very interesting and a complex topic. We are continuing the state of incarceration focus all month long. So please join us this Thursday at noon for Engage ICT Mini, when we'll be talking about youth incarceration with Yusuf Presley of Progeny and the YP Project. You can also find the recording of this and other Engage ICT discussions on our website, KMUW, under events. For KMUW, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo.